The knock hit my front door so hard it shook the glass. 3 heavy bangs. Not the kind that says neighbor. Not the kind that says package. The kind that says whoever is outside already believes they have authority over your night. I was halfway through reheating leftovers when it happened. The microwave clock read 8:41 p.m. I remember that because for one strange second, as I stood in the kitchen staring toward the hallway, my brain actually tried to convince me it was nothing. Then came the flashlight beams through the front window. Blue and red lights bounced silently across my living room walls. And standing in the middle of my driveway, arms folded, chin lifted, with that cold little smile she always wore when she thought she had finally cornered someone, was Diane Holloway, president of the West Creek HOA, my neighbor, and the woman who had spent the last 2 months trying to turn my life into paperwork. I opened the door and found 2 police officers on my porch. The older one looked calm. The younger one looked cautious. Diane stood several feet behind them near the walk, close enough to hear everything and far enough to pretend she was only there as a concerned resident. The older officer asked, "Are you Tyler Mercer?" "Yeah." "We received a report of threats, harassment, and possible property damage involving a neighborhood dispute." I looked past him, straight at Diane. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just held that expression, satisfied. That was the moment I knew this wasn't some misunderstanding. This was escalation. Diane had finally stopped pretending she wanted compliance and decided she wanted fear instead. What she didn't know, what she absolutely should have known before she dragged police onto my property, was that I had cameras covering my driveway, my porch, my side gate, and the strip of yard where she'd spent weeks trespassing, taking pictures and inventing complaints. She thought the police were arriving to scare me. They were actually arriving to watch her case collapse in real time, and by the time those officers pulled away from my curb, Diane Holloway wasn't the one being believed. She was the one explaining why she had lied. "My name is Tyler Mercer, and I bought my house in a subdivision outside Boise, Idaho, after my divorce. It wasn't a dramatic house, no giant columns, no custom stonework, just a one-story place with a decent garage, a narrow side yard, and a backyard big enough for a grill, a workbench, and some peace. That peace was the important part. After everything fell apart, I didn't want impressive. I wanted quiet, something mine. Somewhere I could rebuild routines without having to explain myself to anybody." For the first 6 months, West Creek was fine. Then Diane Holloway became HOA president. Diane was the kind of woman who weaponized calm. She never yelled, never needed to. She spoke in a careful, polished tone that made every insult sound like a policy update. She always carried a folder, always had a note, always seemed to appear right when something around my house had improved enough to bother her. The first time she came over, I was replacing the old side gate. She stood at the edge of my driveway and said, "I wanted to discuss whether your current work has board visibility." "Board visibility?" "Yes, exterior modifications can create neighborhood concern." "It's a gate," I said. "It's visible." That was Diane in 2 words. It's visible. As if the offense wasn't what I was doing, but that she had to look at it. I told her it was a replacement gate, same height, same swing, better wood. She gave me a patient little smile and said, "Sometimes intent matters less than community reaction." There was no community reaction. There was Diane. That's all there ever was. The letters started after that. One about the gate stain being too dark relative to surrounding palette. One about my work trailer sitting in the driveway, longer than visually appropriate. One about stacked pavers beside the garage during an active patio repair. Then came the strangest one, a complaint that my backyard privacy screen created an adversarial aesthetic. I actually laughed when I read that. The screen had been approved in writing by the HOA's own architectural review form 6 weeks earlier. I knew because I kept the copy in a folder in the kitchen drawer, so I emailed the approval back. That should have ended it. Instead, the complaints changed shape. They became less about the house and more about me. A neighbor asked if I was having legal trouble. Another asked why police might need access to my backyard. That was when I realized Diane wasn't just sending letters. She was talking, building a story. And in that story, I wasn't a homeowner fixing up his place. I was a problem. So I started documenting everything. I saved every notice, every email, every photo. Then I installed cameras. Not because I was paranoid, because I had seen enough of Diane by then to understand how people like her operate. They don't need truth. They need atmosphere. Enough comments, enough concerns, enough paper, and sooner or later, other people start treating the lie like weather. The first useful clip came on a Thursday afternoon. Diane entered my side yard through the half-latched gate while I was at work. She stood beside the approved privacy screen, took photos from several angles, then called someone. Later, I'd find out it was another board member. The audio picked up one sentence clearly. If paperwork won't move him, uniforms might. I replayed that clip 3 times. Uniforms might. Not because I had done anything wrong, because she wanted the image of authority on my property. That's the ugliest thing about people like Diane. They don't care what official systems are for. They care how those systems look when pointed at a target. Over the next 2 weeks, she escalated. A fake notice appeared zip-tied to my side gate claiming there was an active setback review. No case number, no city seal, just enough formatting to make it look real from 10 feet away. I bagged it and saved it. Another camera clip caught Diane and a board member named Mark standing at the rear fence line. Diane said, "Once officers show up, he'll understand this isn't optional." Again with the officers, again with the pressure. By then I had already spoken to my attorney, Rachel Boone. Rachel handled property disputes and HOA harassment cases, and she had the exact kind of dry patience that made bad people very expensive to be. After reviewing the letters and clips, she said, "She's trying to manufacture enforcement." "Can she?" Rachel gave me a flat look. "Not legally." Then came the night she called the police. The officers on my porch repeated the complaint. Threats, harassment, possible property damage, neighbor safety concerns. I asked very calmly, "Would you like to see the permits first or the footage?" The older officer blinked once. "You have footage?" "Yes." Behind them, Diane shifted. Small movement, but I noticed it. She had expected me confused, expected me rattled. That's how these things work. Bullies borrow authority because they assume the shock of it will do half the job. I stepped aside and invited the officers just inside the entryway. Not deep into the house, just enough to stand near the hallway table. Diane tried to follow. The younger officer held up a hand. "Not you, ma'am." That one moment changed everything. You could actually see it on Diane's face. For the first time that night, she looked uncertain. I showed the officers the permit folder first. HOA approval for the privacy screen. City receipt for the patio repair. Photos of the gate replacement before and after. Then I pulled up the clips. Diane in my side yard taking photos without permission. Diane saying, "If paperwork won't move him, uniforms might." Then the fence line clip. "Once officers show up, he'll understand this isn't optional." The older officer watched that one twice. Then he asked me, "Do you have anything from tonight?" I nodded and opened the driveway feed. At 8:16 p.m., Diane stood at the curb with her phone to her ear. No confrontation, no me, no threat. She kept looking toward my house while talking, pacing slowly, as if rehearsing distress. The younger officer leaned in closer. "That's before we got here?" "Yes." He glanced toward the porch. Then the older officer asked the question I had been waiting for. "Has she been on your property before without permission?" "Multiple times." I showed him the timestamps. He stepped back, took a slow breath, and said, "Stay here a minute." The officers went back outside. I stayed in the doorway, close enough to hear. The older officer's tone toward Diane was completely different now. Ma'am, can you explain why your complaint says he threatened you tonight when your video does not show any contact? Diane started fast, talking about a pattern of intimidation, community concerns, escalating hostility. The younger officer interrupted. That's not what we asked. She tried again, said she felt unsafe, said I had been aggressive in prior interactions. The older officer asked, did he threaten you tonight? A pause. Then, not directly. That was it. That was the sentence that killed her whole performance. Then why did you report threats? He asked. Diane crossed her arms tighter. Because this situation is getting out of control. The younger officer said, no, ma'am. You called in a threat complaint. That's different. She started talking about the HOA, neighborhood standards, unauthorized work, visual hostility. Even in that moment, she couldn't stop sounding ridiculous. Then the older officer asked, do you have any proof he damaged your property? Another pause. No, but did he trespass on your property? No, but then what exactly are we doing here? There was a silence so clean I could feel it from the doorway. Diane had no answer, because the answer was obvious. She wanted police in my driveway. She wanted the neighbors watching from behind curtains. She wanted the lights, the uniforms, the implication that I was trouble. And now 2 actual officers were standing there, forcing her to say it without saying it. They didn't arrest her, but they did document everything. They photographed the fake notice I'd bagged. They took my statement, took the clip references, and very clearly told Diane to stop entering my property and to stop using police as leverage in a civil HOA dispute. The older officer's final line to her was perfect. Ma'am, neighborhood disagreements are not criminal complaints just because you want them to be. Then they left. Diane stood in the glow of my porch light for a second like she had forgotten how to move. Then she turned and walked back across the street without looking at me. Rachel filed the next morning. Harassment, trespass, interference with lawful property use, request for injunctive relief, preservation demand for every HOA email, text, and complaint involving my address. That's when the board started breaking. One member resigned. Another quietly sent Rachel an email chain where Diane wrote, "The point is pressure, not citation." That became Rachel's favorite sentence. At the hearing, she put it on a screen for everyone to read. The point is pressure, not citation. Then she played the clips. Then the body cam summary, noting that the reported threats were unsupported by evidence on scene. By the time Diane's attorney tried to call it a misunderstanding, the judge already looked done with her. The order was simple and brutal. No direct contact. No unsupported HOA enforcement against my approved projects. No entry onto my property by Diane or HOA agents without lawful basis. And the written findings warned against using police or official-looking notices to pressure homeowners in private disputes. Diane resigned 12 days later for personal reasons. Of course she did. That's always how people like her leave. Never because they were caught. Never because they lied. Just personal reasons. These days, the gate is finished. The privacy screen is still standing. The rosemary planters are still there, cluttering the visual tone of the neighborhood, I'm sure. And every now and then, when I'm out in the driveway in the evening, I think about those cruisers rolling in and the look on Diane's face behind them. She thought the police were coming to help her finish what the letter started. Instead, they took my side. Not because I made some dramatic speech, not because I got lucky, because I had the truth, the footage, the permits, and a woman across the street who had finally borrowed more authority than she could carry. How did you like the story? Subscribe to my YouTube channel.